Chapter 77. The battle against the Empire begins. The battlefield stretched endlessly beneath the pale light of the sky, a stark contrast between the disciplined Imperial legions and the silent, composed ranks of Rimuru's forces. The Empire had brought forth an overwhelming number of soldiers, their armor glinting under the sun, their formations precise, drilled to near perfection. At first glance, their sheer numbers alone would have made any conventional army falter. But this was no ordinary war. They were not fighting against a human nation. They stood against an existence far beyond their comprehension. From atop his command post, the Imperial general surveyed the battlefield with a confident smirk. He had spent years preparing for this invasion, studying military strategy, and calculating the power balance between the Empire and its foes. The Demon Lord Rimuru was a rising force, yes, but still, he was but one entity. No single being, no matter how powerful, could hope to stand against the military might of the Empire. Or so they believed. The Imperial forces stood in disciplined silence, waiting for the command to march forward. Then, with a resounding bellow, the war horns sounded. The first battalions surged ahead, thousands of men moving as one, their boots pounding against the earth like rolling thunder. Across the battlefield, Rimuru stood among his people, watching the advancing army with an expression of quiet contemplation. The winds of war carried with them the scent of steel and sweat, the weight of death hanging in the air before the first sword was even drawn. His forces, an eclectic mix of warriors, demons, and monsters, stood without fear. They did not waver, did not shift nervously in place. They merely waited, their trust in their Lord Absolute. The enemy had numbers, but numbers would not save them. As the Imperial soldiers crossed into range, the air itself seemed to change. The weight of magic thickened, and the world held its breath. In an instant, a surge of crimson light shot through the battlefield. The first line of Imperial soldiers barely had time to register what had happened before their bodies erupted into flames. Screams tore through the air as men fell, armor melting into their flesh, their weapons turning to slag in their hands. Rimuru had made his move. The Red Oni stood at the front lines, his katana gleaming with an ethereal glow, his aura flickering with the heat of his power. He did not speak, did not waste time with threats or warnings. Instead, he raised his hand, and in response, the flames of hell themselves answered his call. Fire erupted across the Imperial ranks, an inferno that spread as though it were alive, twisting and turning as if hunting down every enemy in its path. The disciplined formation of the Empire wavered. Cries of horror and pain filled the air, drowning out the sound of their war horns. Then, before the remaining soldiers could react, a second figure surged forward. Cheyenne moved like a force of nature, a whirlwind of destruction. Her massive sword swung in a perfect arc, cutting through steel and flesh alike as though they were made of paper. The Imperial soldiers barely had time to raise their shields before they were split in two, bodies collapsing into the mud. Her laughter rang through the battlefield, a chilling, almost joyful sound amidst the carnage. For the first time, the Imperial forces hesitated. Their once unshakable discipline faltered. These were not mere warriors standing against them, they were monsters. Rimuru watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. He had given them a chance. If they had surrendered, perhaps they would have been spared. But now, they would face the full wrath of a demon lord. And the battle had only just begun. Rimuru and Cheyenne unleashed destruction. The battlefield was already stained with the screams of the fallen. But the battle was far from over. The disciplined ranks of the Empire, once standing in rigid, calculated formations, were beginning to waver. The first wave of their forces had been utterly obliterated, charred corpses and shattered armor lay scattered across the ground, a grim testament to the power they had foolishly underestimated. Yet, even in the face of such devastation, the next line of Imperial soldiers surged forward. Driven by sheer military discipline and years of unwavering obedience to the Empire, they charged with battle cries that shook the air, their polished blades gleaming as they sought to overwhelm their foes through sheer numbers. But numbers meant nothing in the presence of absolute power. Rimuru took a single step forward, his crimson eyes burning with a dangerous light. His blade, Enjetsu, pulsed in his grip, the very air around it distorting from the heat radiating from its edge. He could feel the presence of the oncoming soldiers, each one a life ready to be snuffed out. With a flick of his wrist, he slashed the air in front of him. A burst of flame exploded outward in a perfect arc, a wave of red-hot destruction that surged toward the charging Imperial troops. The first ranks barely had time to react before the fire engulfed them, searing flesh from bone, reducing metal to molten slag. The ground itself cracked and burned under the sheer intensity of the heat. Screams filled the battlefield as dozens of soldiers fell in an instant, their bodies reduced to smoldering husks. The men behind them stumbled, the sight of their comrades' instantaneous demise shaking their resolve. Their training demanded that they press forward, but something primal, something deeper than discipline, held them back. Fear. Rimuru exhaled slowly, allowing the embers of his magic to dissipate into the wind. His gaze flickered over the remaining soldiers, his lips curling into a smirk. "If you had any sense, you'd run now," he said casually. His voice was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. Yet before they could make that choice, another force descended upon them. A blur of violet streaked across the battlefield, moving with such speed that the Imperial soldiers barely registered her presence before it was too late. Cheyenne's massive greatsword cleaved through a wall of shields like they were made of parchment. With a single swing, she sent bodies flying, the sheer force of her attack carving a path of destruction through the enemy ranks. She moved without hesitation, reveling in the chaos. A grin stretched across her face as she twisted through the battlefield, her blade an extension of her own deadly will. Every swing of her weapon brought devastation. Each impact sent soldiers crumpling like broken dolls, their armor shattering under the sheer force of her strikes. One Imperial captain, clad in ornate armor, raised his halberd and bellowed, "Hold the line! She's just one warrior." His words were cut short as Cheyenne leaped toward him, her massive blade descending in a brutal, downward strike. The captain barely had time to raise his weapon in defense before his entire body was crushed beneath the force of her blow. A sickening crack echoed as his armor crumpled like paper, his body reduced to a broken mess beneath the weight of her attack. Blood spattered across the faces of the soldiers standing nearby, their expressions frozen in horror. Cheyenne let out a laugh, wiping a streak of crimson from her cheek. "Come on now," she taunted, swinging her blade lazily to shake off the blood. "I thought the Empire's elite were supposed to put up a fight." The soldiers hesitated. Their numbers were still in the thousands, and yet, it didn't matter. They were not fighting mere warriors. They were facing monsters. Rimuru and Cheyenne stood amidst the carnage, the battlefield around them littered with bodies, flames still crackling in the air. The initial confidence of the Imperial forces had been shattered. The strategy of the Empire had always been rooted in overwhelming their enemies with sheer numbers and superior tactics. But none of that meant anything against an opponent who simply did not care. Rimuru turned toward Rimuru, who had yet to move, watching the slaughter unfold with an unreadable expression. "Shall we end this quickly, my lord?" he asked. Rimuru considered it for a moment. He could see the fear taking hold in the enemy ranks, the realization sinking in that they had vastly miscalculated. "No," Rimuru said finally, his voice even. "Let them feel it a little longer." Rimuru smirked. Cheyenne's grin widened. The massacre would continue. The elite Imperial Knights enter the battle. The battlefield was a wasteland of smoldering bodies and shattered steel. What had once been a confident, disciplined Imperial force was now reduced to scattered groups of terrified soldiers, desperately trying to reform their lines. The once proud banners of the Empire, which had symbolized power and authority across the continent, now lay trampled in the dirt, soaked in the blood of their fallen comrades. And yet, despite the overwhelming slaughter, not all hope was lost for the Empire. A low rumble echoed across the battlefield as the ground trembled beneath the synchronized march of an elite force. Unlike the broken ranks of common soldiers, these warriors moved with unshaken precision, their armor gleaming with powerful enchantments, their weapons humming with condensed magical energy. Their arrival was not met with cheers from the remaining Imperial soldiers, but rather with desperate glances, hope mingled with disbelief. The elite Imperial Knights had entered the fray. Their presence alone sent a ripple through the battlefield, a wave of renewed determination for the faltering Imperial forces. These were not mere foot soldiers, nor were they standard officers of the Empire's army. These knights represented the pinnacle of the Empire's military might, hand-picked warriors trained to fight against the strongest monsters and the most powerful beings in existence. At their head rode a man whose presence demanded silence. Grand Knight Commander Reghan, a warrior whose name was known even among the most elite of the Empire. His armor, crafted from the rarest magical alloys, shimmered with a divine glow, its surface etched with runes that pulsed with energy. At his hip rested a blade unlike any other, a sword forged in the sacred fires of the Empire's highest temple, a weapon said to cut through even the most powerful of magical barriers. He gazed over the battlefield with cold calculation. He had watched from afar, analyzing the carnage, observing the effortless slaughter delivered by the enemy. He had known this battle would not be easy, but he had not expected such a humiliating defeat for the Empire's forces. Still, it was not over yet. With a single motion, he raised his sword skyward. The knights behind him immediately responded, their weapons igniting with brilliant arcs of energy. A surge of mana flooded the battlefield as the elite warriors activated their combat blessings, spells layered upon their bodies, strengthening them far beyond human limits. Their movements became sharper, faster, and their bodies pulsed with raw magical force. Regan's voice rang out, firm and unyielding. Formation Alpha, focus on the targets ahead. The Demon Lord's subordinates are powerful, but they are not invincible. We cut through them here and now. The moment the command was given, the knights surged forward. Their approach was unlike anything the previous Imperial forces had displayed. Their movements were neither chaotic nor desperate. Instead, they fought with seamless coordination, weaving between one another in a deadly dance of blade and magic. Rimuru, who had until now been playing with his enemies, felt a sharp shift in the air. The first strike came like lightning. A knight clad in enchanted silver armor shot forward, his speed enhanced beyond human capability. His blade, reinforced with anti-magic properties, aimed straight for Benimaru's heart. Fast, but not fast enough. Benimaru's katana met the incoming strike, the force of the impact sending a shockwave across the battlefield. The knight's eyes widened in disbelief. He had put his full strength into the attack, expecting to overwhelm the enemy in a single motion. Instead, he found himself being pushed back, his boots carving deep trenches into the dirt as Benimaru forced him into retreat. "TCH, you're more interesting than the others," Benimaru admitted, rolling his shoulders. But still not enough. Elsewhere, Cheyenne was facing off against a trio of elite knights, each wielding massive war hammers designed to crush monsters in a single blow. They moved in unison, striking with enough force to split the ground apart. Yet Cheyenne met them with nothing but an amused grin. One hammer came down, aiming for her skull. In a flash of violet energy, Cheyenne caught the massive weapon with her bare hand, stopping it mid-swing. The knight holding it struggled, eyes wide in shock as he tried to push against her grip. But he might as well have been pushing against a mountain. Cheyenne clicked her tongue. "Not bad," she said, "but too slow." With a single flex of her arm, she shattered the war hammer into pieces. The knights barely had time to react before she spun, her massive sword cleaving through them like they were nothing more than training dummies. Their enchanted armor, designed to withstand even the mightiest of blows, failed to protect them. Their bodies crumpled, blood splattering across the battlefield. Reghan watched as his men fell, his grip tightening on his sword. So, the Demon Lord's subordinates were beyond even the expectations of the Empire's strongest warriors. Then that left only one option. Drawing in a deep breath, Reghan gathered his mana, his aura expanding outward in a wave of golden light. The temperature of the battlefield changed. the oppressive heat of Benimaru's flames momentarily subdued by the sheer pressure of the Knight Commander's presence. He fixed his gaze upon the true target, Demon Lord Rimuru. Without another word, he surged forward. In a blur of motion, Rejhan crossed the battlefield, cutting through anything that stood in his way. The ground cracked beneath his feet as he pushed beyond the limits of human speed. His sword pulsed with divine energy, prepared to sever anything that opposed him. And then he was upon him. With all his strength, Rejhan swung his sacred blade, aiming directly for Rimuru's heart. And yet, the sword never reached its target. A soft, almost indifferent sigh escaped Rimuru's lips as he lifted a single finger. With an almost casual flick of his wrist, an invisible force repelled Regan's attack, stopping it mere inches from his chest. For the first time in his life, Rejhan felt something unfamiliar. Absolute, undeniable terror. Rimuru's overwhelming power. Rejhan had never known fear. He had spent his life on the battlefield, rising through the ranks of the Empire's military, his strength forged through countless wars. He had faced legendary creatures, toppled rebel kings, and dueled against warriors whose names were etched into history. In every battle, he had emerged victorious, his blade cutting down all who opposed the Empire. But now, as his sword halted mere inches from its target, as an unseen force repelled his mightiest strike with effortless ease, he finally understood what it meant to stand before something beyond human comprehension. Rimuru Tempest had not moved. He had not drawn a weapon. He had not even lifted a hand in defense. And yet, Regan's ultimate attack, an assault empowered by the divine enchantments of his blade and the full extent of his own battle-honed strength, had amounted to nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. The Imperial Knights, who had fought so valiantly mere moments ago, now stood frozen, their weapons gripped in trembling hands. The weight of Rimuru's presence bore down on them, suffocating, absolute. The battlefield itself seemed to reject them, the air thick with something far more terrifying than mere magic. A force that defied logic. A power beyond mortality. Regan's mind raced. How? His instincts screamed at him to move, to retreat, to do anything other than remain in striking range of the Demon Lord. But his body refused to obey. Rimuru's golden eyes flickered with something unreadable. Boredom, perhaps, or mild curiosity. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering the Knight Commander before him. Then, with a voice as calm as the still air before a storm, Rimuru spoke. I wonder, was that supposed to be impressive? The words struck harder than any blade. Regan's breath hitched. He had faced humiliation before. He had suffered wounds that should have killed him, endured trials that broke lesser men. But never, not once, had his strength been treated as insignificant. His grip tightened around his sword. He had to move. He had to retreat, regroup, find a way to strike again. He never got the chance. Rimuru lifted a single hand, palm facing outward. It was a slow, deliberate motion, as if the Demon Lord saw no reason to rush. Then came the pressure. A crushing weight bore down upon the battlefield, far greater than any magical force the Imperial soldiers had ever encountered. It was neither flame nor ice, neither wind nor lightning. It was pure will, an unseen force that wrapped around the knights and pressed them into the earth, suffocating, unrelenting. Rejhan dropped to one knee, struggling to breathe. Around him, his men collapsed entirely, some gasping, others rendered unconscious by the sheer intensity of Rimuru's aura. This was domination, not through brute strength, not through violence. This was something deeper, the undeniable recognition of a superior being, an entity so far above them that resisting was not simply foolish but impossible. Rimuru sighed, lowering his hand. I had hoped the Empire would send someone interesting, but this, he exhaled slowly, as if dismissing the entire battle as a minor inconvenience. This is just a waste of time. Rejhan snarled, forcing his body to move. He wouldn't accept this. He couldn't. He wouldn't allow his legacy to end here, on his knees, crushed by an opponent who barely acknowledged him. With a guttural roar, He gathered every ounce of his strength, preparing for one final strike. He never even saw Rimuru move. One moment, Rimuru was standing before him. The next, a soft pressure touched his chest. Then, everything shattered. Rejhan didn't understand what had happened. He felt a sharp pain, followed by a void where his strength had once been. His vision blurred. His limbs went numb. He looked down. There was nothing. The armor that had protected him from countless battles was gone. No, it hadn't been broken. It had been erased. The skin beneath it, his very flesh and bones, had vanished without a trace. A hole the size of a fist had been carved through his chest, but there was no blood, no wounds, just emptiness. He gasped, his strength leaving him. His sword slipped from his grasp, clattering uselessly to the ground. He was dying, and Rimuru had done it with a single touch. As Rejhan collapsed, his vision darkening, he heard the demon lord's final words. Goodbye. Then, there was nothing. The battlefield was silent. The Empire's greatest knight had fallen. Not in a grand duel. Not in a desperate last stand. He had simply ceased to be. The remaining soldiers could no longer comprehend what they were facing. Their will had already been fractured, but now it was gone. This was no war, no battle. This was annihilation. Somewhere in the distance, a lone sword fell from trembling fingers, the sound deafening in the unnatural quiet. Then, as if a dam had broken, the first cry rang out. Run! The Imperial army broke. Thousands of men, trained soldiers, veterans of countless wars, turned and fled. Their formations collapsed as survival instincts overpowered military discipline. It was no longer about winning. It was no longer about duty. It was about escaping. Rimuru watched them go, his expression unreadable. Benimaru and Cheyenne, still standing amidst the carnage, exchanged glances. Cheyenne sighed. That's it? I was just getting started. Benimaru smirked. They learned their lesson. Not that it'll save them. Diablo, who had been watching with a quiet smile, finally spoke. Shall I chase them, my lord? A little punishment for their arrogance, perhaps. Rimuru considered it for a moment. Then he shook his head. No. Let them run. His eyes flickered with amusement. Fear will do far more damage than we ever could. And so, the battlefield was left to the victors. The once mighty empire, the force that had sought to claim the world as its own, had been reduced to nothing more than prey. And the era of Rimuru Tempest had truly begun. No mercy for the empire. The battlefield, once a storm of clashing weapons and battle cries, had fallen into an eerie silence. The once mighty Imperial army was now little more than a sea of corpses and broken weapons. Only a handful of their elite remained, frozen in fear, their eyes darting between their fallen commander and the demon lord who had shattered their will. The word had already been spoken. Run. And so they did. The once disciplined soldiers, men trained to die for their empire, were now fleeing without a second thought. Their ranks disintegrated as they abandoned their weapons, their armor weighing them down in their desperate attempt to escape. Pride, duty, honor, none of it mattered anymore. They had stared into the abyss and realized the truth. This was not a war. This was execution. Watching them scatter, Rimuru exhaled, his expression unreadable. He had given them a chance. Had the Empire not chosen the path of arrogance, had they surrendered before forcing his hand, perhaps things could have ended differently. But now there would be no mercy. Rimuru raised a single hand, and the world itself seemed to shudder in anticipation. The air thickened with mana, the ground vibrating as an immense energy coalesced around him. A deep hum resonated across the battlefield, the very fabric of reality bending to his will. Then, in an instant, he released it. From the center of Rimuru's palm, an invisible force expanded outward, a wave of pure, unfiltered destruction. It was not fire nor lightning, not wind nor ice. It was something greater, a concept made manifest, obliteration. The fleeing soldiers never stood a chance. The first ranks disintegrated before they could scream, their bodies vanishing into dust, erased from existence itself. Those further away stumbled, watching in horror as their comrades simply ceased to be. The panic only grew. They ran faster. They begged. But there was no escape. The force spread outward, unrelenting and absolute, consuming all in its path. What had once been an army numbering in the thousands was now reduced to a few scattered survivors at the farthest edges of the battlefield, those fortunate enough to have been just beyond the reach of the blast. For a moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. The dust settled, revealing a vast, empty crater where the Empire's forces had once stood. The very earth had been reshaped by Rimuru's will, leaving no trace of the lives that had been extinguished. Silence followed. Then, a single terrified gasp broke the stillness. One of the remaining soldiers, trembling uncontrollably, fell to his knees. His breath came in ragged sobs, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. They had lost. No, it was worse than that. This was annihilation. A few others still lived, their bodies shaking, their weapons slipping from their hands. Their eyes, once filled with resolve, were now empty, hollow. There was no will to fight. There was no strength to resist. There was only the undeniable, inescapable reality that the Empire had made a fatal mistake. And there would be no second chances. Cheyenne took a slow step forward, dragging the tip of her massive sword through the dirt, her violet eyes gleaming with amusement. Oh, some of them are still standing. She raised her weapon, preparing to finish the job. But before she could swing, a voice stopped her. That's enough. It was Rimuru. Cheyenne hesitated, glancing back. But, my lord, Rimuru shook his head. Let them go. Cheyenne frowned, but obeyed, lowering her sword. Benimaru sighed, cracking his neck as he sheathed his own blade. They won't last long anyway. The fear alone will kill them. He wasn't wrong. The survivors, those lucky few who still drew breath, would carry this horror with them. They would return to the Empire, if they could even bring themselves to move. And when they did, their message would be clear. The Empire had stood against Demon Lord Rimuru Tempest, and the Empire had fallen. Diablo stepped forward, his crimson eyes gleaming with cruel delight. Shall I follow them, my lord? He asked smoothly. I could ensure that their suffering is prolonged. No, Rimuru interrupted. Not yet. Diablo raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He understood the meaning behind his lord's words. The fear they had instilled today, it would do more damage than any blade could. The survivors would return to the Empire. They would speak of what they had seen, and the terror of Rimuru's power would spread like wildfire. Let the Empire tremble. Let them realize the weight of their arrogance. This was not a kingdom they could conquer. This was a domain ruled by a true demon lord, and the world would soon understand the full extent of that power. Imperial officers in despair. The survivors of the Imperial army staggered through the remnants of their once proud war camp. Once a symbol of the Empire's indomitable might, the camp now felt like a ghost town. Tents torn apart by retreating soldiers, supply wagons overturned, the air thick with the lingering stench of burnt flesh and despair. Most of them had not stopped running since the battle had ended. Even now, even after escaping the immediate grasp of the Demon Lord's forces, fear still clung to them like an unshakable curse. Among them was General Alvarto, one of the highest-ranking commanders of the Empire's expeditionary forces. A man who had once commanded thousands, now reduced to a lone figure wandering through the remains of a battle that had never truly been a battle. His hands trembled as he entered the remains of the war tent, where the few surviving officers had gathered. His once immaculate uniform was tattered, smeared with dirt and blood. Not his own, but that of those who had fallen beside him. His normally sharp eyes, which had led countless troops to victory, were now clouded with something alien to him. Fear. Inside the tent, the other officers sat in silence. No one spoke. No one dared to break the suffocating stillness that had settled over them. At last, it was strategist Dulman, the Empire's leading military tactician, who finally spoke. What have we done? His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. His hands, normally steady and composed, clutched at the edges of the war table as if to keep himself from collapsing. His eyes darted across the map sprawled before him, as if hoping desperately that there was still some way, any way, to salvage this disaster. But there was nothing. The once meticulously crafted battle plan, drawn with the confidence of a strategist who had never known defeat, now felt meaningless. The red markers symbolizing the Empire's forces had been wiped away, their real-world counterparts erased in an instant by the unfathomable power of one being. General Alvardo clenched his fists. He had always believed in the strength of the Empire. He had been taught since birth that their military might was unmatched, that no force, be it monster, demon, or otherwise, could ever threaten their dominance. But the battlefield had shown him a truth that he could no longer deny. The Empire was nothing compared to the demon lord Rimuru. Dullman swallowed hard, forcing himself to confront the nightmare that they now faced. This wasn't a war. This wasn't even a battle. It was a slaughter. No one disagreed. They had gone into this fight believing in their superiority. They had looked at the monsters, at the demon lord, as obstacles to be overcome. They had convinced themselves that their weapons, their soldiers, their numbers, their arrogance would be enough. But Rimuru had shattered that illusion with nothing more than a gesture. General Alvardo closed his eyes, struggling to steady his breath. "We underestimated him," he admitted, though the words tasted like poison on his tongue. "No, that's not even the right word. We misunderstood what we were dealing with." Dullman let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Misunderstood?" He shook his head. "I don't even think we ever truly comprehended what Rimuru Tempest is." A heavy silence followed. No one had an answer. And then, finally, the question was spoken. "What do we do now?" The words came from a younger officer, his voice trembling. He had been one of the most promising commanders of the new generation, a soldier who had once believed that the Empire was invincible. Now he looked like a lost child. Alvardo let out a long breath. "We retreat. We regroup. And we warn the Emperor." Another officer scoffed bitterly. Warn him? The Emperor already knew about Rimuru. He ignored it. He sent us anyway. The thought sent a fresh wave of despair through the tent. They had marched into a war they had never been prepared for, fighting an opponent whose power surpassed even the wildest myths and legends. And for what? For an emperor who hadn't even considered the possibility of failure? Alvardo's hands clenched tighter. He had always been loyal. He had fought in the name of the Empire without question. But now he wasn't sure if the Empire deserved that loyalty. Dullman slowly sank into his chair, his head in his hands. "If we tell the truth, if we tell the Emperor exactly what happened, he might not believe us." His voice was hollow. "But if we lie, if we downplay what we've seen," he trailed off. It didn't matter. Because whether they spoke the truth or not, one thing was certain. The Empire was doomed. Beyond the ruined war camp, the few remaining survivors of the Imperial Army continued their march through the wilderness. Their boots dragged through the dirt, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They had begun this campaign as conquerors. Now, they were nothing more than broken men, fleeing from a force they could never hope to defeat. Somewhere in the distance, a storm rumbled, as if the world itself acknowledged the inevitable. Rimuru's War Council. Far from the battlefield, within the grand halls of Tempest, a different kind of battle was taking place. The War Council had convened. Seated at the head of the room, Rimuru rested his chin on one hand, his golden eyes surveying the gathered figures before him. His closest subordinates, the ones who had fought beside him, the ones who had led his armies to absolute victory, now awaited his judgment on what would come next. The energy in the room was a strange mix of satisfaction and intensity. They had won decisively, but the war itself was not yet over. The Rimuru stood with his arms crossed, his expression calm but alert. He had led the battle personally, and though he had enjoyed himself, there was no arrogance in his stance. Only readiness. If Rimuru gave the order, he would march again without hesitation. Across from him, Cheyenne leaned against the wall, her massive blade resting at her side. She was still brimming with energy, an impatient glint in her violet eyes. "I don't see why we stopped," she muttered, stretching lazily. "We could have finished off the rest of them. A clean victory is a clean victory." Diablo, who sat nearby, chuckled softly. "Oh, but it was far more entertaining to watch them break, don't you think?" His crimson eyes gleamed with amusement. "Fear is a far greater weapon than brute force, after all." Cheyenne rolled her eyes. "I prefer brute force." Rimuru exhaled, shaking his head. "We made the right call. The Empire's remaining forces will carry the weight of their defeat back home. They'll spread the truth of what happened here, and that fear will cripple them more than any sword ever could." At the center of it all, Rimuru listened. He had already made his decision, but he wanted to hear their thoughts. It had been too easy. The Empire had arrived with arrogance, believing in their invincibility, and Rimuru had crushed them without effort. But what came next? That was the true question. Sui stepped forward, his presence as quiet as a shadow. "Our scouts have confirmed that the remaining Imperial officers are in full retreat," he reported. "They have no means of rallying their forces. It is safe to say that, for now, the war has been halted." "For now," Rimuru echoed. He could feel it, the tension that still lingered, the incomplete nature of this victory. He had expected the Empire to be powerful. He had prepared for a true battle. Instead, the moment he had unleashed a fraction of his power, the enemy had shattered like glass. They had not been a true challenge, and that left him uneasy. His fingers drummed against the table. "What do we know about the Emperor himself?" Dino, who had been silent up until now, let out a long sigh. "The guy's a mystery," he admitted. "We know he's powerful, more powerful than the ones you just wiped out. But how powerful?" He shrugged. "No one knows. He's been around for ages, but he never leaves the Empire. He doesn't fight, doesn't show his face much." Rimuru's eyes narrowed. That was dangerous. An enemy who hid their true power was always a problem. Diablo leaned forward slightly, his smirk never fading. "Would you like me to investigate personally, my lord?" Rimuru considered it. Diablo was more than capable. If he wanted, he could send his most trusted subordinate directly into the heart of the Empire's territory. But something didn't sit right with him. "No," Rimuru decided. "Not yet." Cheyenne raised an eyebrow. "Not yet." Rimuru's gaze darkened slightly. This was too easy. The room fell silent. Rimuru frowned. "You think the Empire was holding back?" Rimuru exhaled. "I don't know, but I don't like it. The war should have been harder." Even with all his power, even with the strength of his subordinates, he had expected more. The Empire wasn't weak. They had conquered entire continents. They had ruled through force for centuries. So why had they crumbled so easily? Sui's voice was quiet but sharp. "You think this was a test?" Rimuru nodded slowly. "Or a distraction? If the Empire had another move planned, something worse than a direct invasion, then it meant this war was far from over." Rimuru tensed. "Then what's the next step?" Rimuru leaned back. "We wait." Cheyenne groaned. "Ugh, waiting." "We let the survivors go," Rimuru said, his voice calm but firm. "We let them spread fear. Let them tell the truth of what happened here. The Emperor will hear of it soon enough. And then they would see his response. Would the Emperor acknowledge defeat? Would he send more forces? Or was he already preparing something else? Either way, Rimuru would be ready. For now, the world needed time to understand what had happened here. And when the time was right, he would finish what had begun. The rise of the Demon Lord. The world had changed. Though the battle itself had lasted only a short time, its impact would ripple across nations, reshaping the very foundations of power. The once mighty empire, which had sought to expand its dominion with unshakable arrogance, had suffered a defeat so absolute, so catastrophic, that it defied comprehension. And at the center of it all stood one figure, Rimuru Tempest. The name that had once been whispered only within the monster territories now spread like wildfire across every kingdom, every noble court, every hidden faction that watched the balance of power with wary eyes. The demon lord Rimuru had proven himself beyond any doubt. The aftermath of war. Messengers rode through the night, their horses pushing beyond their limits as they carried the news to every corner of the world. The Empire's invasion had not merely failed, it had been utterly erased. The survivors, those few unfortunate enough to have escaped the battlefield, were in no condition to fight another war. They spoke in hushed, trembling voices, their minds shattered by what they had seen. They spoke of a demon lord who did not fight wars, he ended them. They told of a single being who had wiped out entire battalions with nothing more than his presence. They whispered of soldiers who had begged for mercy, only to be consumed by a power that defied all reason. And above all, they carried a single message to their emperor. There is no victory against Rimuru Tempest. The Empire's inner circle reacts. Within the gilded halls of the imperial palace, the atmosphere was suffocating. The emperor's advisors, once brimming with confidence, now sat in silence, their faces pale. Some clutched at their robes as if trying to stop their own bodies from trembling. Others avoided eye contact altogether, their gazes fixed on the floor, afraid to even meet their emperor's gaze. None dared to speak first. Then, at last, the emperor himself leaned forward. His expression betrayed nothing. He had heard the reports. He had read the accounts. He had studied the aftermath of the battle with cold, meticulous precision. And yet, he said nothing. Minutes passed. The tension grew unbearable. Finally, one of his highest generals gathered the courage to speak. His voice was measured, carefully controlled, but there was no mistaking the fear behind it. Your Majesty, this demon lord, he is not an enemy we can defeat through conventional means. A pause, then another, and then, at last, the emperor laughed. Low at first, then deeper, darker, resonating through the chamber like a storm brewing beneath the surface of the world. The advisors flinched. The general swallowed nervously. The emperor's laughter faded, and when he spoke again, his voice was filled with something new. Not fear, excitement. So, the world has finally given me a worthy opponent. The other demon lords take notice. Far beyond the borders of the empire, in places hidden from mortal eyes, other demon lords began to stir. Rimuru's rise had not gone unnoticed. Some saw opportunity, a new power to align with, a ruler who had already surpassed the expectations of even the strongest monsters. Others saw a threat. For centuries, the balance of power between demon lords had been fragile, upheld by unspoken rules and ancient rivalries. Now, one of their own had broken the natural order. A new predator had entered the game, and the question on every demon lord's mind was the same. Would Rimuru seek to rule them all? Tempest, the dawn of a new era. Back in Tempest, the people celebrated. The war had ended. Victory was theirs. But beneath the cheers, beneath the relief, there was something more, a realization. Their leader was no longer just Rimuru Tempest, the slime. He was now a sovereign ruler, a demon lord whose power rivaled the gods themselves. The world would never be the same, and the age of kings and emperors had come to an end. The age of the demon lord had begun.